There are games that we remember fondly due to how well they've aged in our minds. Memories of playing them with friends, discovering cool features and hidden levels, struggling against a hard boss fight, or even just opening the game up for the first time. These are feelings that tend to linger after the finer details fade over time. Those moments begin to blur together, forming a version of the game that exists more in memory than in actual reality. That's the power of nostalgia, or what some might even call nostalgia glasses. Nostalgia can only carry a game so far because when we go back to these games years later, the reality hits us. What once felt magical may now feel awkward, dated, or strangely unfamiliar. The picture we have in our heads often feels completely different to the reality. This forces us to confront a truth that may be a little uncomfortable to experience, being that some games just don't age gracefully when we play them today. Video games are products of their time in a different way compared to other mediums like music and film, being that they're interactive experiences. They're shaped by artistic intent, but also by other factors like hardware limitations, design philosophies, and assumptions about how players are willing to engage with them. What once felt groundbreaking and intuitive can begin to feel clumsy over time. Things that might have been seen as ambitious back in the 90s or 2000s can feel plain unnecessary today. These shifts don't happen because the games themselves have changed, but because the context surrounding them has. Our expectations evolve and developers find ways to make things more user-friendly, which result in previous entries feeling outdated. When we first revisit these games, it becomes clear that they're simply products of their time, which often doesn't lead to them feeling the same when we play them today. Now, instead of singling out individual games, it's a lot more useful to look at the patterns behind why they struggle to hold up. Games rarely age poorly for just one reason, and it's even less likely because they were poorly made. More often, they fall victim to shifts in things like technology, experimental control schemes, unrefined mechanics, or even design decisions built around expectations that may no longer exist. One of the earliest and most obvious places where this disconnect shows up is the transition to 3D graphics during the late 90s, particularly in the N64 and PlayStation 1 era. At the time, these games felt revolutionary, especially coming from the Super Nintendo era, which used sprites and tile-based art. Fully explorable 3D spaces was something that players had never experienced before, and the technical limitations were easy to overlook because the sense of possibility was just so strong. When we go back to many of these games today, that early ambition is also where the cracks start to show. Titles like Goldeneye 007, once praised for their realism and immersion, now reveal low polygon environments, blurred textures, and heavy visual compromises that modern displays don't hide. What once felt cinematic and revolutionary now feels like a relic of the past. A great example that I like to use for this is the original Final Fantasy VII, which released on the PS1 in 1997. Its iconic characters, soundtrack, and story are held with high praise for a reason, but I also can't deny that many aspects of it just haven't aged well. From what I've seen and heard, the game was seen as extremely groundbreaking when it first came out, since it was one of the first RPGs that used 3D models and high-quality CG cutscenes. If you look back on it now though, it appears very dated, with its Roblox-like character models and blocky textures. Its predecessor Final Fantasy VI, which released on the Super Nintendo 3 years prior, has arguably aged much better in terms of visuals and aesthetics. This isn't because either game had a better artistic direction or vision, it's simply due to the fact that FF7 was one of the earliest high-budget 3D RPGs. This has now been dated by advancements in technology over time. You can see a clear example of this if you fast forward to the PlayStation 2, where Final Fantasy X released 4 years later in 2001. Even if you stick to the same console, Final Fantasy VIII and IX both released on the PlayStation 1, and you can already see that Square was making some improvements with their character models. There's a reason that the Final Fantasy VII remake was so highly anticipated, and it's because players wanted to experience the game in a modern way with a fresh coat of paint. As noticeable as dated visuals can be, they're just one of the reasons that stop players from revisiting older games. Another hurdle tends to be how those games feel to play. Controls and mechanical design are shaped just as much by experimentation as technology, and plenty of older games have not aged well in that regard. Camera control, character movement, and basic interaction hadn't yet settled into the conventions that we now take for granted. I find that this is very common in some of the earlier action RPGs, which were developed during the period where games were transitioning into 3D gameplay during the early 2000s. One of the best examples I can give is Kingdom Hearts 1, aka one of the most iconic JRPGs of all time. Kingdom Hearts is one of my favourite game franchises ever, and part of that is because the first entry is such a great introduction to the series. However, there's no denying that the original PS2 version of the game has aged poorly in relation to its mechanics. While its art direction and music remain iconic, going back to the original game today reveals a combat system that feels stiff and restrictive compared to modern action RPGs. The camera can be extremely limiting in tight spaces, the lock-on system is inconsistent, the gummy ship sections are very slow, and certain platforming sections like Deep Jungle can feel very clunky. I'm sure that players can remember the fight against Riku in Hollow Bastion, which is infamous for having a long, unskippable cutscene that the player had to watch every time they wanted to retry the battle. None of these issues made the game bad at the time, but they highlight how much player expectations have shifted. What once felt ambitious and fluid now feels very constrained. Thankfully, the final mixed version of the game introduces fixes for most of these issues, but it doesn't change the fact that the original is a product of its time. You'll find that plenty of games from the early 3D era have received remasters and remakes that make them easier for modern players to experience. Beyond controls and mechanics, another reason games can struggle to age well is simply because they were the first of their kind. First entries in a series may sometimes feel like tech demos compared to the sequels and later installments. They introduce bold ideas and establish an identity. They also test whether a formula even works without the refinement that modern entries might include. The original Assassin's Creed is a very popular example of this. When it came out in 2007, its parkour system, historical setting, and stealth felt unlike anything else on the market. Combine that with a well-told story and Altair as an interesting protagonist, it set a foundation for an extremely successful series. When you actually try to play it today though, you start to see how limited it is compared to later entries in the series. The gameplay feels very repetitive and the side activities are limited. Assassin's Creed needed to exist in its rough form so that its sequels could iterate, streamline, and expand on the foundation that it laid. In hindsight, the game feels less like a complete experience and more like a blueprint, which is evident in how the sequel was able to feel like a much more realized vision of the original concept. Another way games can struggle to age well is through the assumptions that they make about the player. Older games often expected a level of patience, tolerance, and willingness to push through confusion that modern audiences are far less accepting of. I've found that modern games tend to give the player a lot more clarity about what they can actually do inside the game, instead of just putting them out to dry with no sense of direction. This sense of restriction that a player feels in trying to achieve something is known as friction. Limited tutorials, vague objectives, and a lack of feedback were once very common because design conventions hadn't yet shifted towards accessibility and clarity. A good way to see this contrast is by looking at Persona 1 alongside Persona 5. The original Persona places players into complex systems with very little guidance, often leaving progression unclear and mechanics poorly explained. Dungeons are punishing, navigation is confusing, and the game is overall seen as highly experimental by the Persona community. Persona 5 on the other hand still deals with dense systems and long playtimes, but it also communicates constantly. Mechanics like social links, combat, fusions, and palaces are introduced gradually throughout the game. Feedback is clear and the game is structured around respecting the player's time. Persona 1 didn't age poorly because it lacked depth or because it was a terrible game. It aged poorly because it was built around expectations that no longer exist. What was once considered part of the challenge now feels like unnecessary resistance between the player and the experience. A simple look at the difference in UI between Persona 1 and Persona 5 really tells you all you need to know. It's also good to note how developers have managed to incorporate player feedback as time has gone on. A common example of this is random encounters in older JRPGs, which can feel incredibly grating today. I'm sure that plenty of people know the feeling of taking 5 steps and running into a random encounter with long animations. It's design philosophies like these which developers have realized don't necessarily resonate well with modern players, since we tend to value our time a lot more. When people say that a game has aged poorly, it's often framed as a criticism, but that wording misses the bigger picture. These games help to move the medium forward. I personally love the older games which I referred to in this video, with Final Fantasy VII and Kingdom Hearts 1 being some of my all-time favourites. Many of the frustrations we feel when revisiting older titles exist precisely because developers were experimenting. They were solving problems that hadn't been solved yet, often for the first time. Modern games benefit from decades of iteration, player feedback, and established conventions that didn't exist back then. What feels clunky or restrictive today was often necessary groundwork at the time, because that's just the nature of evolution. I think that it's also worth noting that aging poorly doesn't erase a game's impact or importance. FF7 is still culturally significant and arguably the most famous JRPG of all time. Kingdom Hearts 1 remains iconic for its ambitious attempt to merge two completely different worlds. Assassin's Creed still laid the foundation for one of the biggest franchises in gaming. Even Persona 1, despite its friction, helped shape the identity that later games refined and perfected. These titles are remembered because for one reason or another they mattered and they helped their respective franchises to stay relevant to this day. In a way, games that age poorly tell us just as much about the medium as those that hold up perfectly. They act as snapshots of design philosophies in transition, moments where ambition outpaced refinement. I don't think that it's always fair to judge these games with modern standards when we eventually do revisit them. Instead, we should use them to understand how far games have come and why certain ideas evolved the way that they did. Nostalgia may soften our memories, but being able to look back and judge these games for what they are helps us to appreciate the impact that they had in their respective eras. Games don't always age poorly because they're bad. Sometimes they just age poorly because the developers were brave enough to try new ideas which were improved as time went on.